He is the co-host of the NBA podcast. Also, catch his work over at Forbes Sports NBA contributor. Bryan Toporek joins us here on the Boardwalk kind of hotline. So one of the reasons why I, aside from the fact that I enjoy talking to you about the NBA, is the fact that you and Mort had a very interesting conversation on the NBA pod about the situation with the MVP race. And to me, this is kind of where I stand. I'm not against Jokic winning the MVP. I'm not one of those people. But I do feel like there is this attitude about Embiid sometimes that people want to find excuses to not give him credit. When people forget that a huge chunk of those games that he missed was because of COVID protocols. It wasn't all injuries. And to me, and maybe I'm just crazy for thinking this way, but in an irregular regular season, in the COVID pandemic world that we're slowly coming out of, are we really going to hold the same standards against somebody that we would in a real world regular season? I just think it's a little ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that's fair. If it was a question of like Jokic is putting up his normal averages prior to this season, and his main argument was availability versus Embiid, who is setting career highs across the board basically, then yeah, I think it would be a much closer argument than it is right now. And I wrote something at Forbes about this. Like, I don't think the MVP race is over, but I do think Nikola Jokic is the deserved frontrunner right now. Vegas odds makers are favoring him. He's on pace to have only the second season in NBA history with 26 points, 11 rebounds, 8 assists per game. The Nuggets offense is just worlds better with him on the court. I looked this up a couple days ago, but they're averaging like almost 123 points per 100 possessions with him on the floor, which would be almost 6 points better than the best offense in NBA history. They're shooting almost 8 percentage points better with him on the floor. So, you know, I know the battle lines have been drawn between Nuggets Twitter and Sixers Twitter in particular with Jokic and Embiid, and I wrote something at the Step Back about that, where I just want us to really appreciate how good both guys are. They're very different in the ways they approach the game and what makes them so good, but they're both been absolutely dominant this season.
Well, also part of appreciating the fact that in a league full of three-point shooters and guards and Steph Curry going nuts, you have arguably the two main MVP candidates are both 7 foot tall. Like, that in and of itself should be a credit to them and less about anything else. Because to me, we've been waiting for this. Like, as basketball fans, at least I speak for myself, I feel like basketball fans have been waiting for the post-Dirk era of big men. You know, getting past the Dirk, Durant, Anthony Davis guys, dudes who can do those things, but also can go back in the post, because for some of us, we are old enough to remember Hakeem and the Shake and Patrick Ewing and the baseline jumper. And to many of us, it's not that those guys are lesser than the guys today, but maybe those games would have been a little different if they would have played in today's game.
Right. And yeah, I feel like, you know, Anthony Davis was definitely the next big hope for a big man for a while. And he's lived up to that reputation, obviously, what he did with the Pelicans and last year with the Lakers. You know, I feel like Karl Anthony Towns had that label on him for a while, and he's put up huge numbers in Minnesota. That team is just so bad that, you know, I think he's suffering a bit reputation wise. Whereas if that team gets better, if he, you know, forces his way out, gets to another team, I think the perception of Karl Anthony Towns will go up pretty significantly. But yeah, it's been phenomenal to see. Really, I mean, from Philly's perspective, Embiid, this is what we were promised that he could become. When they drafted him with the number 3 pick, it was always a high risk, high ceiling pick. Whereas, like, you know, this guy has the injuries. You don't know that he's ever going to hit this ceiling. But if he does, he has the talent to be the MVP of the league. And whether he wins it this year or not, it's inarguable that he's having an MVP caliber season.
Bryan Toporek joining us here on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN, co-host of the NBA podcast, at B Toporek on Twitter. Check out his work over at Forbes Sports covering the NBA. Now, speaking of the MVP, I got to ask you, because I think one of the other side of the argument to me is, and listen, personally, and maybe it's because I'm in the area, I would give the MVP to Embiid. And it's because, to me, that letter V stands for something. And I feel like every year we have a problem. And that is, the V is supposed to be who is most valuable. And so many times the award is discussed for the guy who has the best stats, who has the most historic numbers, who has the sexiest stat line. And it's like, but that's not the award to me. The award is supposed to be who's the most valuable player, not the best player in the league. Who is the guy who is undoubtedly, if he was taken out of the league, if he was taken off of his team, it would be a huge detriment. And I understand Jokic does fit that category, but to me, Embiid is literally starting to elevate to that level where you put him on almost any team and they're a contender. He's almost getting to that level.
Yeah, I think if you're going with that argument, there's like 5 guys that I'd put in the mix. Jokic, Embiid, Steph Curry, who we saw last night, light up the six. I mean, that Warriors team has no business being around 500. They are, outside of Steph and Draymond, they are garbage. But Steph is just on an absolute historic tear as of late. Dame Lillard, you can put in that conversation, Luka Doncic as well. So it's, I think this is one of those years with the MVP where there isn't a clear-cut favorite. You can make arguments for a bunch of different guys. And, Mort on the podcast has railed against this for years now, how there isn't clear criteria for really any of these awards. What is most valuable player? As you said, is it the guy who, if you remove him from the team would go from 55 wins to 20 wins? Is it the guy who's having the best statistical season? Is it the guy who's on, one of the arguments in Embiid's favor right now, the Sixers are the number 1 team in the East? Is it the guy who contributes to winning the most? I know someone from ESPN tweeted a hilarious stat the other day. It was like, in terms of guys who lead the league in winning percentage, Joel Embiid has the 3rd highest points per game in the league history. It's like, that is such a ridiculously obscure stat, but I'm definitely going to use it all the time to argue that Embiid should be MVP.
I love it. But seriously, like you said, it's one of those deals where you can make an argument for multiple guys. I just feel like, to me at this point, it did feel a little bit, going back to what you guys talked about on the podcast, the whole ESPN did that survey, 90 people, first place votes for Jokic. It almost felt like it was like, well, we'll just give it to him because he survived. And I said on the show yesterday, it's like, listen, what I think of Survivor? I think of WWE Survivor Series, and I think of Thanos saying I'm a survivor. I don't think of the NBA MVP award. So it feels like just because you're the last man standing of not missing games this year shouldn't be a prerequisite of you winning the MVP. So like you said, we don't have a delineation of who should win it. So all of this is so subjective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm excited. If Jokic does win, we can call it the asterisk MEV from now until the end of time, and it's going to infuriate Nuggets Twitter. So that is one bullet in the chamber that we can just hold for now. I will say this: I think Embiid has a chance to overtake Jokic still. I think you're right that it feels like, based on some of the conversation from national writers, especially Brian Windhorst the other day, feels like some of the people who will be voting on this award recognize that right now Jokic should be favorite, but they're not super excited to vote for him. So I think with Embiid in particular, the Sixers had a nationally televised game last night against the Warriors. They have 3 coming up this week against the Suns tomorrow, Bucks Thursday and Saturday. Obviously it would have been nice if they could have gotten the win, but Embiid still put up massive numbers despite the loss, and you can write that off. Ben and Tobias both in the best game, so that was tough sledding there regardless. If they come back and go, win these next 3 games against a very, very good Suns team and a Bucks team, who's one of the best teams in the East, all of a sudden I think that's going to give a little bit of narrative heft to Embiid heading into this stretch run. And you've got 2 games coming up against the Hawks next week, who ever since Nate McMillan took over, they're very quietly ripping off. I think they were like 17-6 or something like that. So they're also, firmly in playoff position in the East. They have a ton of talent, a ton of offensive firepower. It should be a fast-paced, high-scoring game, so should lend itself to Embiid putting up big numbers there. So, yeah, I think, this MVP race could look a lot different in 2 weeks, depending on how the Sixers handle themselves over this next tough stretch.
Yeah, and Clint Capella has an opportunity to prove that he's more than DeAndre Jordan 2.0 as well. So.
Yeah.
Bryan Toporek joining us here on Game Night, the co-host of the NBA podcast here on 97.3 ESPN. Bryan, speaking of the Eastern Conference, obviously there's a lot of attention given to the Sixers and the Nets because they're the 2 top teams. And Kevin Durant gave me an extra bullet in my chamber because he now has a thigh contusion, whatever that's really supposed to mean. I'm not fully sure because at the end of the day, you basically could lump a lot of things under that category, but it's another example to me why I think it's bogus the Nets are favored to win the East, because we've seen these guys on the court for 8 games. 8 games, the 3 of them. And to me, if you have 2 guys with hamstring injuries, which are nagging injuries, another guy who's had, personal reasons why he can't get on the court sometimes, which may or may not be legitimate. I don't know. I don't know Kyrie personally. But what I do know is availability matters in the playoffs. And if for whatever reason Durant or Harden are not out there, I don't think the Nets have a chance in any reality to get to the final. So to me, it's the Sixers should be the favorite, followed by the Bucks, followed by whoever else you want to put in there, because to me, the Nets have this huge question mark over their head of, will these guys ever be on the court, Bryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the number one question for the Nets is health. And this news just came by about 15 minutes ago, but James Harden apparently suffered a setback with his hamstring. He's now out indefinitely. They're talking about, he could be back by the start of the playoffs, could be back a little bit before, but it doesn't sound like we're going to see James Harden anytime soon. So as you said, the KD, Kyrie, James Harden triumvirate will not have played together very much, less than 200 regular season minutes so far. That isn't a ton of time to develop chemistry, develop timing with one another. Their hope is that talent will just win out, because I think if the Nets enter the playoffs fully healthy, and if you can guarantee me that they will stay fully healthy throughout the playoffs, I would put them as the favorite. I think they present, especially with the Sixers, they present a number of matchup problems I don't think the Sixers have good answers for. Are we going to see that fully healthy Nets team? That I don't know. And also, seeding is going to come into play here. You got 3 elite teams in the East: the Nets, the Bucks, and the Sixers. 2 of those teams are going to have to play each other in round 2, barring any upsets. So it makes that race for the number 1 seed really important. I think the Sixers have a chance to come out of the East if they keep that 1 seed. If they fall to 2 or 3, I'm a lot more bearish on their chances.
Yeah, and also if it's the Nets versus the Bucks in the second round, for just to use that as an example, well, guess what? If Durant or Harden don't play, you're telling me the Bucks can't beat the Nets? I mean, Kyrie Irving is a phenomenal talent, but I think he's proven time and time again he can't elevate a team, whereas Giannis has shown you he can at least get you to the conference finals. He hasn't gotten any farther than that, but at least can get you there. So to me, I don't understand the obsession with the Nets. I feel like it's all being driven by the NBA 2K age, as I call them. Everyone who says, I did this trade on NBA 2K and I did this with my roster on NBA 2K, so it must be real.
Yeah, well, I think it's a question of top-end talent tends to win out in the playoffs. And in KD and Harden, again, assuming both are healthy, you could argue those guys are both top 5 talents in the league, or somewhere, top 6, top 7. The only other team in the league like that are the Lakers with LeBron and AD, and the Lakers don't have a number 3 option like Kyrie Irving. So with those 3 guys, I mean, I just don't know how you stop all of them offensively if all of them are healthy. And the Nets have a nice collection of glue guys: Jeff Green, Bruce Brown. They've got some shooters like Landry Shamet, Joe Harris. So they have a nice collection of talent. But again, we just haven't seen them fully together. And, that's the question. Will chemistry end up being an issue? Will they just not have their timing down right? It's, especially late in a close game, especially later in a series as the pressure ramps up, are they going to know where each other is going to be at all times on the court? Are they going to have a full playbook at their disposal? We just don't know. And that's going to be one of the most interesting questions of the playoffs. What version of the Nets do we see?
Bryan, the other question I have about the East is, outside of the Sixers, Nets, and Bucks, which of the other teams would create the biggest threat to the top 3 that's left in the Eastern Conference?
Yeah, that's a good question. Mort actually presented a case for the Atlanta Hawks, which when he talked me through it, it made more sense to me, because they really, again, assuming health here, which has not been a sure thing all season for them, but they've assembled a ton of offensive talent. They could just outgun you in a 7-game series. Trae Young could go off 1 game. Danilo Gallinari could go off 1 game. Bogdan Bogdanovic could go off 1 game. It only takes, each one of those guys having 1 elite game to push you through. I still think it's Miami, and that might just be bias based on what they did last year. But, Jimmy and Bam are just such a tough defensive duo. And then if we get a Victor Oladipo, a healthy Victor Oladipo added to the mix, I'm not super high on him and his fit there, especially, I think adding him with Jimmy and Bam, that's a lot of non-shooters on the floor at one time. So he might be better off in a 6-man role. But, Tyler Hero, Duncan Robinson can go off at any given time. They also added Trevor Ariza, Bjelica, Sixers legend, Nemanja Bjelica at the trade deadline. So, I think they have, if everything breaks right for them, I think they could pose problems. But they've just been so inconsistent all year that it's hard to have a ton of faith in them. Like, I don't think I'm going to go into any of those series picking Miami to upset any of the top 3. But I didn't go into the series last year with Miami and Milwaukee picking Miami to win. Or I don't even think I picked Miami over Boston. So, they kind of thrive. That Heat culture thrives in that underdog role. That wouldn't shock me to see them make some noise again this year.
Yeah, and Nemanja Bjelica will be a part of that Sixers 30 for 30 about 15 years from now. So
that's for sure.
He'll be a topic there. Bryan, before I let you go, and this is more of a selfish question than anything else. This is probably the least NBA legitimate question I have to ask you today. Last night, I'm watching NBA action after Sixers game, and I see the Bucks wearing uniforms that look like the Washington Wizards and the Jazz wearing uniforms that look like the Seattle Supersonics. Can you explain to me modern NBA uniforms? Because I feel like the further we go along, the more I'm seeing teams say, it doesn't matter what our color scheme is, we're just going to create uniforms. And for someone like me who might be watching multiple games at one time, I'm honestly getting confused at times.
Yeah, I think you can thank the NBA's sponsors and jersey creators for that. They just do not care about anything traditional. They just want to print as many different jerseys and sell as much merchandise as possible. Revenues are hurting, man. Fans couldn't come into the stands for most of the year, so you got to make up the money somehow. If you're going to print 15 different jerseys for a 72-game season, I guess that's the way to go.
But I mean, why is it? I mean, this is like, for example, if everyone just had a blackout jersey, like the NFL does this, every team has a blackout jersey. I get that, okay? I totally get that. But at some point, those blackout jerseys still have their team colors on them. And it's like, I'm watching the Bucks game last night. The Bucks were playing Phoenix, thank you. And I'm like, okay, that's Phoenix's uniform. I get it. And you know what? Their fancy uniform, it's a little ridiculous, but it's still their color scheme at least. When I'm watching the Bucks, I'm like, am I watching the Jordan Wizards or am I watching the Bucks? And then I flip over to the Jazz and Lakers game, and I'm like, when did the Seattle Supersonics come back? Like, to me, there's a level between, like, making jerseys and just being, like, insane. Like, I just don't, like, when did the world become Oregon football?
We need what was it called? The NFL, the color rush?
Color rush, like yeah.
The neon vomit. Let's have that for every NBA team. That's the genius idea next year.
He's Bryan Toporek, co-host of the NBA podcast. Check him out on Twitter at @BToporek. His work over at Forbes Sports, and as all guests, he appeared on the Boardwalk on the Hotline. Bryan, always appreciate you jumping on and keep up the great work.
For sure. Thanks for having me, Josh. Anytime.